Hey guys, welcome to the Kim Iversen Show. Thank you so much for being here. We have a really great show for you tonight. 60 years after the assassination of President JFK, John F. Kennedy, one name still stirs up more questions than answers. Lee Harvey Oswald. Was he a lone assassin, a hapless fall guy for a massive conspiracy, or something else entirely? Well, today we dive into the heart of this enigma with Larry Hancock, co-author of The Oswald Puzzle, Reconsidering Lee Harvey Oswald. Larry is no stranger to unraveling historical mysteries. With formal training in history and cultural anthropology and decades of research into Cold War history and national security, Larry has authored over a dozen books on covert operations, political assassinations, and government cover-ups. His works, such as Someone Would Have Talked and Tipping Point, have made him a respected voice amongst historians and researchers. Known as a document geek, Larry's meticulous research and access to declassified records make his insights both credible and captivating. And in his latest book, Larry, alongside his co-author, David Boylan, it re-examines Oswald's life, motives, and the massive conspiracy theories surrounding the JFK assassination. They uncover startling new angles and explore how Oswald may have been manipulated by fervent anti-Castro activists in 1963. So let's crack this puzzle. Larry, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Kim. It's great to be here.
Okay, Lee Harvey Oswald. I was skimming through your book. It's really detailed, going very heavy into Oswald's life. Tell us, before we get into this conversation, tell us, did he do it? Do you think he did it? What do you think?
He did not know, he did not do it, and did not understand what had happened.
Really? Okay.
So,
What evidence do you have that makes you believe that he was not the person behind this? That he didn't kill JFK?
well, the first part is that after the decades of investigation and looking at the forensics evidence, all the material that was presented to show that he was the shooter, the lone shooter, we now understand how poor that evidence is, and the fact that almost any part of it could be challenged in court. Uh, we can see all of the holes in the Warren Commission inquiry, the evidentiary holes, the mistakes that were made. Literally, what we can see now is that in court, all of the chain of evidence material could be challenged against Oswald. Essentially, what we find is that within 24 hours of the assassination, an order was issued within the FBI to make a case against Oswald as the lone gunman, no conspiracy, nothing else involved, and that's what they proceeded to do. So everything that follows from that, unfortunately, becomes questionable.
Yeah.
Oswald was into a lens, let's put it that way.
What when it do you think that he was so you think he didn't even know what had happened? Like he wasn't involved in the conspiracy whatsoever?
Right? He thought something else was going to happen that day. One of the things that's plagued us is his behavior that day is anomalous. It's not his normal behavior, so it requires an explanation. So that's one of the things we tackle in the book. Uh, Something was going on with Oswald. It just was not shooting JFK.
Okay. So let's get into his past a little bit. So the people that are watching this that say, oh, okay, Oswald did it. We all know he did it. Uh, and, these are all just crackpot conspiracy theories. Well, first, actually, before we get into his life a bit and some of the things that don't make sense, were you the latest trove of documents that have been released from the JFK assassination? Did that help you at all? I mean, what has been uncovered in that trove of documents that is there anything significant that you were able to pull from?
It's cumulative. It's not just one release. It really is a decade or more of releases, but there are two parts that were very helpful. First, we got to look inside the Warren Commission and the FBI and the CIA to see what they were really doing versus what they said they were doing. And
Hmm.
that answers your first question. that tells you why the answers they gave are questionable, and the
Right.
case is questionable.
And
So that was
is
part of
that
it.
what you got? Was that from the latest dump of documents?
I would say that comes from actually the past decade, not just
Okay.
the past release, but the last decade of releases. The
Okay.
second part of that is we can see we got enough documents from the CIA in particular to see how involved the CIA was with Oswald, and the fact that there were already operations going on with Oswald that they were forced to cover up and obfuscate. So that was the second part of the releases that really helped, was from the
Okay.
CIA documentation.
How many documents are we still missing?
We're missing, probably that we know of, something on the order of 10,000.
10,000
Of those,
pages.
there are probably three or 400 that are really critical. That
Wow.
some have actually been challenged in court several times, and they're not only being withheld, they're being withheld in court.
Hmm. Do you think Trump is going to release those documents?
That's still an open question. He had a chance to do it before, and he
Yeah.
didn't do it. He said he was going to do it before, he didn't do it. One of the real difficult parts is if the CIA claims national security, is he really going to override a national security claim, which they've been registering in court? That's hard to say.
Yeah. Except if the national security, I mean, if the perpetrators behind the JFK assassination are domestic perpetrators, like if it was CIA or, I mean, then the national security would be. I mean, it seems like we'd want to know that because then we're not that secure. We've been infiltrated, right? We've been
And
taken over,
that's the real problem, because those are the documents that we want. That,
right?
for example, one document that we know of is the CIA itself investigated whether its Cuban exile surrogates and its people were involved. We've got the document showing they investigated it. We can't get the document of what they found. So
Yeah.
that goes along with what you're saying, Kim. It's sort of like, who would release that if it's really there or if it still exists?
Hmm. Yeah. Okay, so let's get into Harvey Oswald's life. What is different about the research that you and your co-author did from previous books or other research that's been put out there?
We went to a lot of new research from people that actually knew Oswald. I mean, he did have friends. One of the striking things that you see is he wasn't a loner. He wasn't antisocial. You know, he had two children. He had a wife. He had proposed to multiple women. He had a social life with people that he agreed with. It kind of takes me back to the 60s. You know, he was an activist.
Hmm.
You could argue with an activist or you could be friends with an activist, but he wasn't asocial or even antisocial. And one of the things that really shows up in his own writing, Kim, is he was very much opposed to racial inequality, uh, to employment inequality, to basically an activist position on, social and civil rights. And so
Hmm.
he's left behind a lot of writings that didn't get brought forward because they didn't match the profile of a lone nut, violent, aggressive person. And we showcase a lot of that in the book, and including information from some of his best friends, including his best friend in Russia, who
Hmm.
has a lot to say about what he really was like that doesn't match what the Warren Commission had to say about him.
So the Warren Commission claims that Oswald was a lone wolf type, antisocial. I mean, what is the picture that they paint?
They picture him as a loner with never
Uh-huh.
any real solid social contacts, emotional contacts, uh, someone who doesn't talk to people and who keeps it all inside. But the interesting thing in the book, we show that he was constantly writing and communicating with organizations as as a young teenager before he went into the Marines. He wrote
Hmm.
the Socialist Workers' Party, essentially saying, "I believe in the socialist workers' cause. I want to join. And by the way, is there a youth group? And if there's not, can I organize one?" It's kind of like, wait
Hmm.
a minute, this is not a loner. He wants to organize his own group.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get into his history then, because I have some questions about that. Was he truly pro-Soviet when he defected to Russia? Did he mean that? Let's kind of get into some of that. What was what was where did he come from? And was he a dumb guy? Was he tell us about his background a little bit.
He came from a very chaotic home environment. His mother separated early. She had multiple children in the military, all over the place. She kept moving around. I think she moved around, half a dozen times through his teenage years. So he was constantly in different schools. Worse yet, she moved from New Orleans to New York City. So suddenly we have this young, you know, 12-year-old, very, vulnerable age, exposed
Hmm.
with a Southern accent and Southern clothing in a New York City school system, and everybody's making fun of him. But
Hmm.
he didn't become violent. What he did was become a truant. And so there was a pattern of truancy when he was involved in situations that were uncomfortable. But when
Hmm.
he was told by a truant officer that's kind of like either you straighten up and fly right and go back to school or something's going to happen, he went back to school. His grades improved. He measured 118 on an IQ test. So this
Which
is
puts him
not
at what? What is that? What does that mean?
That's not genius level, but it's high normal
Okay.
level. Very, as a matter of fact, when he was in the Marines, to really get a feel for that, he was so well read and so well studied that he would debate with his officers. And we have officer testimony from one of his officers who was a graduate of a very prestigious Eastern school in political science, that Oswald could match him in talking about geopolitics and wasn't afraid to do so. And it like
Hmm.
embarrassed the officer in front of the troops, an uncomfortable thing. But Oswald enjoyed that sort of thing. It would Oswald was not bashful. What Oswald believed, he talked about it, and it didn't matter.
So then he goes into the Marines. Why did he go into the Marines?
According to he himself, he by that time he was back in Texas. Another move back in Texas. He was about to graduate, but he was bored with school, and he went into the Marines because he wanted to get away from home, his mother, and go have adventures like an older brother who had also gone into the military. So,
Mm,
and he tested quite well. He tested well enough to be placed in technical schools in the Marines and actually went
hmm.
into radar. So again, another indicator that it basically is an intelligent young man.
Hmm. What is he painted like in the from the Warren Commission or the media? In these last 60 years, do they say he's a bright person that's read, well read the way that you're describing?
They leave that out entirely. It's a matter of cherry picking. I mean, they had an
Uh-huh.
image that they needed to project. So even though the interesting thing is, even though the FBI collected that kind of information, took depositions from his Marines and so on and so forth, that is in the appendices to the Warren Commission. It's not up front in their report where they characterize him. So
Hmm.
even though the data was collected for a full profile, that's not what they did.
So he goes into the Marines. So I want to kind of go over some of the inconsistencies that um, I think the big one is the defection to Russia. And then after, and this was during the Cold War. So he defects to Russia. At what point in his military career, and what does that even mean to really defect, like in the way that
Yeah.
he supposedly defected?
Okay. In Japan. It really started in Japan. He was stationed overseas in Japan, started having a pretty active social life, dating, which he had not done in high school or before. Uh, but as again, a Marine officer said, he's not your normal Marine. All his guys in barracks with him are concerned about, the bars and just the bars. Oswald goes to the bars, Oswald dates, but he starts talking politics, especially to young Japanese students who are socialist, who are quite liberal, and
Hmm.
he gets interested in that. So he starts asking himself, where can he see what they're talking about? And they're talking about Russia. That's post World War II. There's still Russia has a big influence in Japan. Uh, Becomes interested in Russia, starts studying Russian, and actually at that point in time, he has some trouble. He does drink times. He gets busted. He buys a pistol. He loses a stripe. He has some trouble. And one of the things that's a constant for Oswald is he's easily bored. He was bored in school. He gets bored in the Marines, and he starts
Hmm.
looking overseas. He actually registers in a college in Switzerland to go to a liberal college and study political science, those sorts of things. He wants to explore another adventure. But to answer your question, what really happens is he gets an early release because his mother has an injury. He gets out of the Marines like almost a year earlier than when he was supposed to go to the college. And instead, we
Hmm.
find him in Russia. That's that's when he starts using his Russian and goes to Russia with a visa, a tourist visa, gets to Russia, and the first thing he tells his in-tourist guide is, "Oh, by the way, I don't want just a tour. I want to become a Russian citizen." Uh, this is not well received. Actually, they call him in and tell him, "Look, here's your ticket for the train out of Russia. When your visa is expired, we want you gone. We even paid for the train ticket." Okay. Um, so so then he goes to the American embassy and says, "Well, okay, I want to become a Russian citizen." And he says things they don't want to hear, and Oswald is happy to do that. It's kind of like, "Okay, I want to stay here." He never legally defected. He never completed the paperwork to defect. What he did then, and Oswald, like, he could be spontaneous. The American embassy wants nothing to do with him. The Russians want nothing to do with him. His date is about to expire. The in-tourist guide is coming to take him to the train station. He slits his wrist.
Ah,
Not
okay.
big slit in the wrist, enough to bleed some, enough to be hospitalized, and he becomes a huge embarrassment for the Russians. We've got an American ex-Marine who wants to live in Russia, and he wants to live here so desperately. He's done this. What do we do? And we now have all the documentation from within the Russian government that says essentially that. It's like, we just can't kick this guy out. This would not be good PR. We didn't do any big PR when he showed up, but that would be a bad look for us. So they didn't give him citizenship. He's still an American citizen. They let him stay. They gave him a factory job. He wanted to go to college. He got a factory job. So he goes to Minsk in Belarus and goes into a factory job. And for the next 2 years, he has a life inside Russia. He makes friends, starts dating. One of the things we do in the book is show pictures from Russia that probably shock most people because that's a Lee Oswald they've never seen. And they
Hmm.
didn't see in the Warren Commission. Lee Oswald with a girl in a bikini on a beach does not match Lee Oswald with a gun in the backyard. This is
Yeah.
not good. So he proposes, dates, proposes, first proposal's turned down, second proposal accepted, he gets married. So he's married and living in Russia, and frankly, again, gets bored. A few marital problems, a baby comes, few marital problems, and he wants to go back to the U.S. The U.S. doesn't want him. State
Hmm.
Department pushes back against him for over a year, but he has a case because he is legally an American citizen. He is not defected. They have no right to refuse him. And so
Hmm.
eventually he works the system. He understands the rules and regulations, works the system, and comes back to the US with his wife and daughter June, and they move back into the Fort Worth area.
Okay, so this is one of the parts of the story that I think is confusing to a lot of us, that it looks like an inconsistency. How does, during the Cold War, a former US Marine go defect essentially or try to defect to Russia and then come back to the United States, like be allowed to come back to the United States with the wife and kid? And not only that, but the State Department loaned him some money in order to help him get back,
Yeah.
right? They gave him $435 for repatriation, which, I mean, during the Cold War, this part of it doesn't make sense. So do you think that him going to Russia was legitimate. Like he really did love the Soviet Union. He really wanted to be there. And do you think that his coming back was also legitimate? Or do you think that there's some sort of conspiracy surrounding all of this? Because it feels conspiracy. It feels like
Yeah.
how in the world? And they loaned him money to repatriate. Like you got to be kidding me.
Yeah, two things. First of all, it's not totally unique. There are other examples of this occurring. It's just not generally talked about. As long as you didn't legally defect, become a Soviet citizen, and actively, speak out against the United States. In other words, we did have people that did that, and the Soviet
Mm-hmm.
Union used them big time for public relations, and they spilled. But Oswald didn't do that. The bottom line, I think he was serious about wanting to see how Russia had implemented socialism. He really wanted to
Mm-hmm.
see that, and he hated it. As a matter of fact, we present Oswald is the first person in the world to ever go on strike in a Soviet factory. He actually went on a one-man strike, refused to work because he hated the system and thought it was inefficient. He was good friends with the supervisor, and this was big trouble for a supervisor. So he actually does things that inside the Soviet that he writes about after he comes back. He is very willing to talk about how unhappy he was with the Soviet system, and it would have actually been good propaganda material from our viewpoint. He actually did a lecture to a Jesuit college talking about the difficulties in their system, the problems with it.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I think he was sincere going over. We speculate that he might have actually done a deal with the State Department to provide information as part of his return, because
Mm-hmm.
on his return, they'd been stonewalling him all this time, and then suddenly it's okay. He's changed. His attitude is better. He's changed. We think that he may have agreed to provide information on his time in Russia, not big information, but at least what went on in the factory, so on and so forth. A basic debrief, because even on his way back on the boat, he writes in his diary that he resents having been used and he is not going to be used again. So there is
Hmm.
a suspicion that he may have done a deal to make himself look better to the State Department, whatever that involved. I
Yeah.
can't say. No
So
record of
that's
it.
when you think that's the moment you think he maybe became an asset, like an intelligence asset or State Department or something along those lines. It was when he wanted to come back home. And so, in order to come back home, you think then he was like, okay, I guess I'll
And,
play along.
and, and we actually know from the timing when his CIA 201 file, it's not like the State Department and the FBI and everybody didn't know about him when he
Hmm.
went to Russia. It was internal, but his CIA 201 file was not open for like over a year after he's there. So the speculation is he became of interest well after he had been into Russia. So whatever it was that we're not seeing, suddenly he's of interest, and the CIA never explained that. As a matter of fact, the House Select Committee on Assassination asked them to explain that, and they could
Hmm.
not, as to
Hmm.
what that delay was all about.
Hmm. Okay. Um, so how long was he in the Marines? Was it just 3 years and he was supposed to do a
Uh,
fourth?
2 year, 2 year, 3 year hitch. In other
Okay.
words, yeah. So he was in the U.S. for the better part of a year and training in tech schools, overseas for a better part of a year, and then 6 months, 8 months back in the U.S. in
And
California.
then and then
And
he
he
went
did
to
get an
Russia.
early out. Right. Then he went to
Okay.
Russia.
And then he went to Russia. And during the time that he was a Marine, tell us about the sharpshooting. And was he a great shoot? Was he a great shot? Was he a
When
great
he was in
sharpshooter?
training, and one of the things I've got to get, because what we were looking for is continuity and consistency with Oswald. What do you really
Okay.
see long term? One of the things we see long term is Oswald can throw himself into things and then get bored. When he was
Hmm.
in basic infantry training in the Marines, he performed as a sharpshooter. At the end of his hitch, the last time he was tested in the Marines, he barely qualified at all with a rifle.
Okay.
It's kind of like, when it's important to him, he can do it. when it's not important to him, it's kind of like when he was in the Marines and overseas in Japan, he was having some problems. And as I said, he ended up in the brig, lots of things. But when he's back in the U.S. in his last evaluations are great before his
Hmm.
discharge, rated 4 or 4.5 on a 5-point scale. Technical performance is great. So one thing about Oswald is that when he's interested in it, he's good, and when he's not, he's not.
Okay. So, I mean, you could then make an argument that he would have been interested in shooting JFK if he was the assassin. And so maybe he did make the shot because if it was important, which that would have been, then do you think he would have been capable of doing that?
Right. Well, first of all, I think that was the argument that was made. Absolutely,
Mhm.
that his politics were radical. The problem with that is his politics were an exact match for JFK. Uh, they could not, when they interviewed people who knew Oswald, it's like he likes the administration. He's especially positive about Kennedy's position on integration,
Mhm.
social welfare. When he was asked about JFK, he remarked that he liked the president. As a matter of fact, when he was on radio talking about Cuba and they tried to get him to make a statement against JFK, he refused. As a matter of fact, he said, no, I will not say that against the president. There are issues with administration policies. So that's one of the problems the Warren Commission had is they could not find a motive that
Yeah.
aligned with shooting because of that. However, to your point, what he was and clearly was interested in by the fall of 1963 was Cuba. Cuban socialism, getting to Cuba. He was making every effort to get to Cuba as he had gotten to Russia, to
Mhm.
participate in their socialist revolution, if you will, to see what, if it, he had been dissatisfied and disenchanted with Russia, maybe Cuba would work for him. So
And do
that's
you
the
think that
counter
was a
argument.
genuine you think that was genuine? Like, I mean, how does a person go to Russia with, rose-colored glasses on, gets there and says, "Actually, I don't like this. This sucks. I want to go back." What why do you think he wouldn't have just been disillusioned entirely with socialism? And so that part also doesn't seem to make sense to me. Like, why would he then say, "Oh, but Cuba"? But I mean, do you think that was genuine or this is part of the now he's working as an asset?
Well, that's what is consistent about him is he's smart enough. He's constantly reading about politics and geopolitics and systems, capitalism.
Mhm.
He wrote a monograph in 1963. He actually wrote several papers, monographs of what he thought the ideal political system would be. Some capitalism, some socialism. And
Mhm.
he spent enough time doing that, so it's consistent with what he was writing as a teenager. But he's a critic. Oswald at all times is a critic. He tells it as he sees it. So when he saw it in Russia and it didn't fit what he expected, he tells it like he sees it. He's
Mhm.
still looking at Cuba. If he'd gotten to Cuba, it might have been different. But he even told one of his best friends that he was always looking for something that he was afraid he was never going to find. And so that's the perspective, that's the individual perspective of him. And you're right, Kim, there are disconnects, but not with his basic character. He's always looking for something and critical at the same time. Uh,
Mhm.
he got a job with a photography studio in Dallas, excited about photography until he got bored with it. But then he got back to his, well, let's look back to politics. What am I
Mhm.
really looking for? So that's just the view of Oswald as an individual.
What about this trip to Mexico he took? How could he afford to travel to Mexico City, and what was he doing when he was there?
Um, actually, one of the things that you have to keep in context with, starting in January of '63, he and his wife had been starting the paperwork to go back to Russia with their children. And that was going to be easy because she was still a Soviet citizen. Okay.
Mhm.
For Oswald, they've got to let him back in, right? So that's more problematic. But they write a whole string of letters and appeals to the Russian embassies all year long, up until November. They're still doing this like 2 weeks before the assassination, of her returning and him coming if he can. On Oswald's perspective, she was writing letters, he was writing letters.
Why did
Oswald
he
is
want to go
taking the position.
back?
Uh, we don't think he wanted to go back. Marina, his wife, wanted to go back. She was unhappy with him. He hadn't delivered what he living in America was not what she expected. He could never hold a job. He was hard to live with, no doubt about that.
Yeah.
She even writes that she could go back and get a job as a pharmacist. She can't get a job in the U.S. So she
Isn't
is
that
willing to
funny?
go back. Yeah.
It's kind of funny that, the American goes to the Soviet Union, stays there, hates it, wants to go home. The Russian comes to America, the land of the free or whatever. And she's like, I hate it. I want to go home. I mean, it's just,
But she can't get a car. It's like she's living with a husband who is so idealistic that he's not concerned about the thing. And that's their friends constantly say that this is the problem. She is concerned about everyday things, and
Mhm.
things that she's not getting, doesn't have access to. He could care less. He's a cheapskate. You know, he'll buy shoes for the baby, but Marina is not going to get a refrigerator.
Got it.
That's the way it is.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that makes sense, but sometimes that's life.
Right.
But but he is when going to Mexico, to answer your question, he goes to Mexico, and what he does is he goes to the Cuban embassy and says, I want a tourist visa because my wife is going back to the US, but it's going to be difficult. I mean, she's going back to Russia. It's going to take a while. This is in progress, but I think I could handle it better if I wasn't in the US because I'm concerned about the FBI. I've been harassed, uh, and he had exchanges with the FBI. Uh, I would like to handle this from inside Cuba, and I would like to go to Cuba. And it's a long story there, but they say, well, we would, but we can't do that until the Russians say that they're letting you back in, and they're letting her back in. He goes to the Russian embassy, gives this same story, and the Russians say, well, we can't do that now. Her request is still being considered. And it's like, okay, is this a Hail Mary? I mean, it's sort of, he's not having any luck with the embassy in New York City. He tries the embassy, maybe they would have let him through. He knows from reading what he's reading from his reading materials, and we go through that in the book, that Americans are being allowed into Cuba if they can show that they are totally loyal. They're fair play for Cuba committee members, which he is. They're activist, and he was doing he's built a resume for himself in New Orleans as a Cuban activist for the revolution. Maybe they'll let him in, and they don't. But it's kind of like Moscow in a way. The Russians didn't let him in either until he did something radical. Now he's in Mexico City trying to promote himself as a street activist, is the term he used, and they're not buying it because they've already been used to Americans trying to infiltrate Cuba. They're,
Right.
they're you know,
But I mean, it kind of seems like maybe that's what he was doing. I mean, how did he even get the money to go to Mexico City?
um, I will not pretend that we can explain all of that. There is a gap. There are people that contacted him in New Orleans that we feel
Mm.
helped get him there. They were actually working for what we present in the book is we know that they were working for the CIA. They were they were surrogates working actually for the DRE, student group working for the DRE, who had already, and I think a key factor is, as of August, months before he went to Mexico City, they had already started a propaganda campaign using Oswald as the focus of that propaganda campaign, as showing as an example of Cuban, the Cubans are able to influence this naive American Marine to become a Castro activist and supporter. This is terrible. They're writing Congress, they're writing other groups. This propaganda campaign is already underway without Oswald even knowing it's going on. When they approach Oswald, the scenario that we pursue is they don't approach Oswald as CIA. They approach Oswald as Castro supporters who like him And hey, he's doing the right thing. We like Americans who support us. We'll help get you to Cuba. I know that's one thing I want to do with the book. I want to separate the biography part of the book in the first half from the
Uh-huh.
speculative scenario in the second half. We try to do history and some speculation, but they're different.
Right. Okay. Um, I so you don't think, do you think from all of the documents you've been, everything you've been studying and everything you know, do you think he was genuine about Cuba and Castro? You think that he wasn't working as an asset at that point? I mean,
No.
if he already was working as an asset potentially coming back from Russia, if that was part of the deal, then why wouldn't he be forced to infiltrate these pro Castro groups and pretend like, yeah, and I'm also for Cuba and Castro and yay, socialism, and still be like used now to infiltrate into those groups? And I mean, but it sounds like what you're saying is you think that he was genuine. It just doesn't, I just don't know how one person could have been used like multiple times like this, been able to afford going to these places. It just doesn't make sense.
What? Okay, two or three things. As far as the money is concerned, a couple of things, and this has to do with the continuity. Oswald was perennially cheap. Oswald did have jobs. Oswald collected unemployment. Oswald did have money, and he had money to spend on what he wanted to spend on, which was not necessarily his family. Okay, uh, he managed to come up with the money for magazine subscriptions for whatever. Um, but and getting to Mexico City, even if it was by bus. Not that I trust the full Warren Commission picture of how he got to Mexico City. I'm not
Hmm.
going there, but doesn't require that much money because, and we have evidence of him being there. But be that as it may, I think the real answer to your question is the continuity in his character. The continuity of his character. This is something that he had been interested in for years and years and years. It wasn't new. When he was in the Marines, one of his best friends in the Marines named Delgado, he was already back in 59 talking about going to Cuba and
Hmm.
participating in the Cuban Revolution. And he was, I need to learn Spanish. How about you and I get out of the Marines? And when we get out of the Marines, we go to Cuba and we can help carry this revolution forward. So it's not a new thing for Oswald. There's a lot of consistency in there.
But I could
Um,
also see where, I mean, once you've experienced the Soviet Union, where you'd be like, okay, never mind. And then I could see where the CIA would say, well, you used to be really into this, so just keep pretending like you are, and then go and infiltrate, and we'll see if we can get you into Cuba, and we'll make it because this is something you've always been interested in. Yeah, maybe you don't like it anymore. Maybe you're like tried and true capitalist now, but but you can still pretend because it's in your history. I mean, that to me seems believable. And maybe why they chose him, in fact, is because he used to have these radical ideals and then he was jaded in Russia. And they were like, yeah, but we can use this. Nobody else knows that you've been jaded totally. So we can use this. I mean, that makes sense to me too.
Well, and actually, the view would be they did choose to use him. That when he was actually operational within the CIA without his knowledge at three different levels before he went to Mexico City. Okay,
Yeah.
one was for counterintelligence purposes. He doesn't have to know about that. Two for propaganda, which he doesn't have to know about. He just needs to do what he's been doing. And the, one of the things, one of the reasons this makes sense to me, and it might not make sense to others, is I've looked at so many examples of how the agency did these things. I mean, the best asset for propaganda is somebody who's doing what they're doing and you leverage it. You know,
Right.
you don't
Right.
it's deniable because it's real. And to
Right.
that extent, the best thing about Oswald is if you let him be real and find a way to use him, deniability is there. Nobody can ever
Mm.
track him to you. The other thing is we know from the documents that have been released that they were already had several operations in place to infiltrate Cuba through Mexico. They were working against the embassy in Mexico. They had already put F, Fair Play for Cuba committee members who are real assets inside Cuba. They were already
Hmm.
doing this, and they doing it very gracefully, and it was working. The way Oswald handled himself in Mexico City is not at all similar to what we know that they were doing. If we didn't have that as a benchmark, I wouldn't have reached this conclusion. But now we
Right.
can see what they were doing.
So you think that he was, when he got back to the US, he still was this rabid pro socialist, pro Cuba, pro Castro guy. And that when he was in those groups, when he had joined those groups that of like minded people, some of the people were actually not like minded people, but they were actually CIA. And they then used him without his knowledge and basically, and maybe then said to him things like, hey, we can get you to Mexico City, we can help you out. And it was the CIA doing it, him not realizing it, him being like, "Oh, that's cool, really? Okay, great. Yeah, let's get me to
Yeah,
Mexico City." And then they tell him, and this is what you do when you get there. By the way, we've got others that have done this, and he thinks that they're comrades, but in fact, they're infiltrators. They're setting him up. That's what you think what happened.
that's well said. That's absolutely it.
Okay.
And they even show him. They take him to the airport that week of the assassination, and they have him watch from a car them rent a plane to fly him out of Dallas. Okay, and he thinks it's set up for that day. What they tell, but because this incident is actually reported, it's
Hmm.
documented. It was reported to the FBI, and we've chased this down a long time. But what he thinks is going to happen is not going to happen. He's never going to get on that plane, quite frankly. He is going to be dead before he gets on the plane, probably with information planted with him to again implicate the Castro regime in the assassination. So,
Hmm.
yes, there's a conspiracy. There's something going on. That's why Oswald that weekend, one of the most inconsistent things of his behavior that day, he does things that support what you just said. Like, okay,
Hmm.
I think I know what's going on, but he doesn't. But that weekend, he's telling his wife and his brother and his family, "I didn't do anything. This don't believe what they're saying. This is, there's nothing to worry about." He tells his wife he's concerned that she's going to buy shoes for the baby. This
Hmm.
is not a guy who really thinks he's got a problem, really, and he doesn't until he gets shot dead, and there is no court appearance.
Okay, so let's just back up for a second. So in September of '63, he's in Mexico City. How long was he in Mexico City trying to petition the Cuba? So what exactly was he trying to get to Cuba, or was he trying to get to the Soviet Union? I guess I'm a little
He was there
confused on
for
that.
three. He was 3 days. He was there for 3 days. The first place he appears is at the Cuban consulate, embassy, and consulate, and he
Hmm.
he tells them he wants a tourist visa because he wants to be in Cuba while his arrangements are made to take his family back to Russia. But he
Okay, so
wants to
he
be in.
thinks in his mind that if he gets to Cuba, it'll be easier for the Soviets to let him in. Like he thinks that the government will be more amenable if he's sitting in Cuba, which is a friendly nation to the Soviets. So he's like, if I get to your ally, then maybe you'll let me in. That's what he's thinking
Yeah.
in his mind.
And if he makes
Okay.
it to Russia, in all honesty, he's has an off and on relationship with his family. He has
Hmm.
already told his wife. They've had an agreement, and Marita testified to this back in New Orleans. He told her that was his goal was to go to Cuba, even if he had to hijack a plane to go to Cuba. And she said he was an idiot. Okay.
Yeah.
And she would have no part. She would have no part in it. But if he could get to Cuba and have them come to Cuba to be with him, she would come to Cuba to be with him. So he may have
Okay.
thought that, or quite frankly, he may have thought they go back to Russia. I'm in Cuba. I'm where I want to be. We're good. I
Yeah.
can't
Okay.
read it, but it could be either one of those.
So he might have
And
been thinking,
and he
well, I'll
wouldn't
go
just
live in
arrive.
Cuba. Uh huh.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he
Okay.
wouldn't just arrive in Cuba like he did in Russia. He would be a figure of importance when he gets to Cuba this way. He is somebody, not just a tour. If he arrives in an airplane from the US, he's somebody for Cuban propaganda purposes, unlike his experience in Russia.
How did he think he was going to get an airplane?
I'm sorry, I translated forward to November 22nd.
Okay, okay,
I
you're
realized
right.
just what I said there, yes, but no, otherwise it would have been he just arrives and he joins the Cuban Revolution. Does I will point out that we trace the fact in the book that in that period between New Orleans and Mexico City, he is, for example, reported as having visited a Cuban gun runner, an American was a close personal friend of Castro, with a Cuban, okay, and they go to this Cuban gun dealer to buy a lot of weapons for a revolution in Central America. So our position is on his way, he's already been set up by these anti-Castro Cubans who are pretending to be real Cuban revolutionaries. He thinks he's going to be something
Uh-huh.
when all is said and done.
So you're thinking these CIA assets really were setting him up. I mean, they were, because this is also fantastical. I mean, it's like, how does a guy go and live in Russia and then he's able to come back? The State Department gives him some money. And then he's got suddenly some money to go to Mexico City, where he petitions the Cubans and the Soviets to try to go live in Cuba or this back in the
Mhm.
Soviet Union. And then he gets connected with a gun runner, a Cuban gun runner who's close friends with Castro. Like, what are the chances of any of the like this is
Yeah, right.
just like
It's not
this is
cheap. Yeah,
it's
yeah,
nonsense, right? I
it's
mean, it
not
seems
cheap.
like how and why wouldn't that then pique his mind and be like, wait a minute, this isn't normal. Like, normal people don't have these experiences.
Well, I think the real answer to that, Kim, is, and this is what the Warren Commission, Oswald was not your average person. He's intellectual or quasi-intellectual. He's bright. He's adventurous. He's not, by the time we're talking about here, the fall of 1963, I grew up in the same time period as Oswald. This is a
Mhm.
kid who's adventurous enough and bright enough and motivated enough to have been in the Marines, in Russia, Russian wife back in the U.S., demonstrating he's a unique personality. And I guess
Yeah.
not totally unique, but he's not your average person. And I will have to say, when you get to the fall of 1963, he's in a position where he's suitable to be framed. I mean, if you're
Okay.
going to pick someone to frame to link to Fidel Castro in a conspiracy to kill the American president, it's not your average off the street guy. You've got to
Yeah.
have someone with this kind of background to even be credible to frame them.
Okay, so you're saying the same CIA assets who were pretending to be pro Cuba, pro Castro. It's you're saying it's the same group that got him to Mexico City, that probably got him to Mexico City and maybe paid for it. And it's that same group that connected him with this gun runner, this Castro gun runner. And it's the same group then that set him up with the assassination of JFK. And it's just this one
Right.
group of Cubans, and they were Cuban Americans. They were Cubans. Is
Uh,
that what you're saying?
the way the names that we surface and that we bring up, this is a group of people, some CIA operational people out of Miami Station who have been working with these same guys to try to kill Fidel Castro for 3 years. I mean,
Okay.
they are firm, committed anti-Castro. They've been risking their lives for 3 years to kill Fidel Castro and change the Cuban regime and go home. Okay,
Yeah. So,
and
but these
suddenly,
are,
you know,
but they were pretending to be pro Castro, but they were trying to kill
correct,
him. Hmm.
correct.
Okay. And these are
It
Cubans.
was easy. Yes, it
Yeah.
is. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So he's connected with these Cubans. So why would they kill JFK? I mean, and so with, I mean, I understand them wanting to kill Castro. That makes sense to me. Um, they've got this guy Oswald. They're thinking they can. I mean, do you think that? So this is where it gets. I mean, why didn't any of if these people knew that they were that they were setting this guy up? Wouldn't some? I mean, are they all dead now? Did they all get killed too? I mean, where? Why wouldn't they have
No.
said something later on like, "Hey, yeah, we were part of the conspiracy, or you know what I mean? Like somebody would have talked, right? I know that's the
Yeah.
name of your
Oh,
book.
darn.
Is
Oh, yeah.
that
And they did. Actually, it's just one of the things is they did talk to, in some cases, spouses, lawyers, close friends. I mean, we do have a record from that side of the track, and I have talked secondhand. They were happy about what they had done. They considered this a patriotic act. Uh, they considered, even the CIA officers involved considered JFK to be a traitor.
okay?
This is a nasty conspiracy. And as to your question of why, which I wouldn't have written this Oswald book if I hadn't written Tipping Point first. Tipping Point was the answer to your question. How could this happen? What triggered it? And what triggered it was that these people were told that JFK was beginning negotiations with Castro that would leave Cuba neutral, get Russia out, Cuba would be neutral, and the Castro regime would be there forever. And they were essentially told, he has betrayed you again. He betrayed you at the Bay of Pigs. He betrayed you during the Cuban Missile Crisis. You've been led to believe that he really wanted to do away with Castro. You've been trying to kill the guy for 3 years now. And now he is sending people to negotiate a deal with Castro. That's it.
Interesting.
And
So you
you
think it was
either do
all
it,
because of Cuba?
yeah.
It was Cuba, huh?
And that's, the documents have clearly shown that these people were told this story, as a matter of fact, and essentially told, if the negotiations with Castro were to begin in November 1963, and they were told that if they don't do it now, you're not going home. Again, I didn't say it was pretty, but that's, I think, what it was.
Yeah. I mean, the Cubans, it's interesting even how much power they have now politically. They've had a ton of power in our politics for a very long time. Florida was that's the the swing state of Florida. It was always every politician had to pledge allegiance to the Cubans, right? For forever, they had to basically say death to Castro. Like all of them, every politician on both sides of the aisle. It didn't matter if they were Democrat or Republican. They've all pretty much had to say. Yeah, Castro, yeah, like, and just keep sanctioning Cuba, keep them blockaded, whatever, all of the things we've ever done. And it's, I think for people growing up in my generation, we're like, why? What's the deal here? Like, why are we still so angry at Cuba? Now Castro's gone, and yet we're still, pointing guns at Cuba, basically. I mean, economically. So, and the Cuban Floridians just have so much darn political power. I mean, they've been swinging elections forever. There's so much power in that group, and now I'm kind of wondering if what you're asserting from all of this, the history that you've been able to uncover and research, if it really came down to Cuba, I mean, it kind of makes sense why every politician then bows down to the Cubans and says, well, whatever you want, just don't kill me, or like, these people are
And they have a
dangerous. I
lot of
mean, they'll,
financial have a lot of financial power too, which they
yeah, right.
accumulated. You asked a question about what happened to these guys. Well, some of them went on fight. They were committed to anti-communism. They went to Latin America. They went to Nicaragua. They went to Vietnam. They fought overseas in the Congo. I mean, they were willing to sacrifice their lives over and over again to do anything, even if it seemed peripheral, to fight
Mm-hmm.
against communism in the hope that that would translate to Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like a hereditary commitment. They were sincere about it.
It
But
didn't
others
work. I
of
mean,
them,
you know,
it,
for them, like,
uh,
hey, it didn't work at all. Castro
it,
stayed on for a long time. He held on for a long time. So all of it in vain, all of it.
but some of it brought a lot of money into Florida. Nicaragua, whenever they went overseas, and this gets into a long-term story about doing deniable operations overseas, a lot of, we ship arms overseas, deniably, drugs come back from overseas, deniably. If you're going to use smugglers as your logistics base, smugglers smuggle. A lot of money came into Florida. Let's just put it that way. And
Mm.
the documents are clear on that. And even there was a point in time during the Iran-Contra affair where the CIA we had the document, did a real written deal with Justice Department that Justice would not prosecute their surrogates, the Cuban exiles, over drugs because they needed them to perform operations against the Contra. So you guys, were going to lay off them, right? Which they did. And it's not a good story. Well, of course, none of these are good stories.
No, none of them are. Okay, so bring us back to this plane again. So he goes down to Mexico City in September. You're thinking that this group, that these infiltrators, these CIA assets, Cuban assets, were the ones behind his trip to Mexico City. He failed in Mexico City. He comes back and he's like, I failed. And so they came up with another plan. Is that what you're saying, to get him to Cuba using a plane?
Here's what I would posit happened. Okay, Bess.
Hmm.
He goes back home and he's got a new baby. Okay, he goes back to Dallas. Marina is pregnant. His wife is pregnant. He he constantly ping pong balls, like it's
Wait,
bipolar between
is he in Dallas or is he in New Orleans?
New Orleans to Mexico City to Dallas.
Okay.
His
And he
wife and
lives in,
family have
where is
been
he living?
when he moves back. His wife is already staying with a friend, and she's been there since New Orleans. He moves
Okay.
back into an apartment, and actually for the next 3 months he stays in a series of apartments and visits her routinely on the weekends. He finds a job. For the first place we see him back in Dallas is at the unemployment agency. He's back in
Hmm.
family mode. This didn't work. Okay, you know, now I'm back. I need to get a job. I need to get the family back together. He starts visiting the family. He does find a job. Okay, it's ends up at he looks for jobs in several places. And eventually gets a job at School Book Depository there in downtown Dallas. Keeps looking for jobs, interestingly enough, because he every time he goes to the unemployment office, and I think this is important, when they test him, they all say that he interviews well, he dresses well, he talks well, he tests well enough for a management level job. But
Hmm.
they can't find him a job like that because of two things. He always needs money immediately. He's out of money, so he needs the first job that they can get him. And B, the problem is he's been in Russia. When he got back to Mexico City, he actually applied for a job at another photography company, and they liked him. They were going to interview him, but they called and did a back check at the first Jagger Stovall, the first place he'd worked a couple of years before, and they said, well, he's okay as a worker, but sometimes he made other workers uncomfortable because you might hear him speak Russian. And
Oh,
that was it.
really?
It's all,
Yeah.
this is 1963 in Texas. This is reading a Russian newspaper, speaking Russian. You've limited your job options. So,
Yeah. Okay.
so anyway, he stays with his job. And so for the next few weeks, he does some interesting things. He joins the ACLU. He becomes friends with the wife of the husband, his wife, woman, Mrs. Payne, his wife is staying
Hmm.
with, and he's kind of rebonding with the family. He's got a new daughter, and his wife says, it's just like before. All he was interested in us, and he's interested in us, and we thought it might work. And on that last, it's interesting. We think that he was kind of on a cusp. During this same period of time, he was still in contact with these people, and they're
Where
still
were they
making him.
based? Where were they based?
They had traveled. They were essentially out of Miami, and we traced
Mm.
the path from Miami to New Orleans to Dallas
Okay.
of these people. Where suddenly they have not been in Dallas before. Lee Harvey Oswald shows up in Dallas, and suddenly they're in Dallas doing fundraising, trying to buy weapons, operating in Dallas. Great covers, but so suddenly they're in Dallas, and there's every sign that they contact Oswald, and they're still making this pitch to him. You still want to get to, we're we're still would like to help try to get you there. We're working on a way to get you there. And we think that I know this sounds dramatic and sensational, but it is, that he's kind of left with a choice. Is he going to stay in a manual job, manual work, with his family, or is he going to take this sudden opportunity of getting on this airplane that they've shown him that week and flying to Cuba? And he's going to have to make a choice. And he goes and visits his wife that Thursday and says, well, I'll move you into an appointment immediately. And she says, practically speaking, I got a brand new baby. I'm living with a lady that has a washing machine. You get a washing machine in an apartment and we'll talk.
Right.
And I know that sounds, but it's like real life in a way,
Right.
you
Yeah,
know. And
totally.
what does he
Totally.
do? He goes the next day and he leaves his wedding ring at home. And I don't know, but the next day it looks like his choice has been made that he's going to get on that airplane, and that explains the strange behavior. Lee Harvey Oswald is a news junkie. Everybody he reads more than everybody else his age. We have the evidence of that. He watches TV all the time, and he's interested in politics. If something unusual would not have been going on, he would have been following the president's visit. He
Yeah.
would have been out front watching. And after the shooting, he certainly would have been watching the news like everybody, but he doesn't. He goes off to somewhere else. So there is something going on. That's why we don't maintain that, he's just utterly naive and it happens all around him. There's something else in play.
So he's thinking, because this group has contacted him and they're like, hey, we got another opportunity for you to get to Cuba through this weapons runner, a gun runner.
This is just no. They've already done that. They've kind
Oh,
of
they did
kept
that
his
already.
interest.
Okay.
They take him to the gun runner. Then they take him in Dallas on the way to Mexico City to visit this uh, anti-Castro Cuban activist, young woman, Sylvia Odio, who is actually in Dallas. Uh, and while they're visiting her, they introduce him as Lee Harvey Oswald. She testifies to the FBI about this after the assassination, and they call her back they're there with him at her apartment with her sister. Then they go away, and one of them calls her back, kind of to chat her up, and says, "Oh, you know that guy that was with us? He's a real badass. He's a great sniper. He could shoot JFK. He could shoot Castro. He's a loose cannon."
Mm.
Okay, so they're setting up this image, and this isn't the only place that's going on. We document other places where it's going on. They're setting up this same profile that the Warren Commission would later use of this, off totally out of limits cowboy guy who's off on his own, could do anything radical. So that's part of the backstory. But to answer your question, Kim, on that day, he has been taken to an airport. The airport owner says these people were making sure that that he knew that it was being discussed. This plane was rented for a long distance flight. All the questions they asked were about how much gas does it carry, how far will it go, and he even said at the time he was concerned that he was wondering if they were planning to hijack this plane to Cuba. The guy who was leasing the plane was concerned about this. You can understand that Oswald might be taking this seriously.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so he thinks that they've got him a plane. He's going to go to Cuba, but there was this other turn of events that happened, and he never got on that plane to Cuba. So how do you think it unfolded? What was he thinking was going on that day, and how did he end up being the fall guy?
We know, and this is separately, it's in the other. We have sources that say someone would have talked. You said it earlier, that said
Yeah.
the plan itself blew apart about 12:30, right at the time of the shooting. That Oswald was supposed to go to a theater. He was supposed to meet his contact, and then the rest of the thing would unfold as planned. We suspect he would have been killed, as I said. What what aborted the plan was he got taken into custody. He didn't perform like they expected to perform. We know that when he went back to his apartment, where he picked up his pistol, by the way, pistol, hijack airplane, okay, where he picked up his pistol, he didn't go directly to the apartment. By that time, he was already concerned that something had happened that he wasn't expecting, like an attack on the president. Uh, he'd heard about this on the bus, in the cab. He got dropped off over a block away from his apartment, walked to his apartment, checked it out, and then started towards the theater. And then he encountered a police officer. And the whole thing, he shot the police officer. He didn't shoot, a lot of options appear at that time. The policeman was killed. Oswald ended up, the reports came in from that part of Dallas. He got arrested in the theater, taken into custody, and that part, I mean, the plot had two parts: kill the president, prevent the negotiations, and frame Castro. Uh, the first part, unfortunately, worked. The second part, these same people, the evening of the assassination, the people that I'm talking about that we name, called Claire Booth Luce, the wife of the owner of the Luce Media Network, Time, Life, I mean, the biggest
Mm-hmm.
press outlet in the world, and tell her, and she knows them because they're anti-Castro. They tell her that they have known about Oswald for months. They monitored him. They had him under surveillance. They monitored him in Mexico City, and they have proof that he came to Dallas with a Castro assassinations team and killed the president. And they want this story on the national news. And it doesn't make it for a variety of reasons. But they're still trying, even though the plan aborted in the second part, they were still trying to push this plan for at least 48 hours, even with CIA headquarters telling these people, like the DRE group, don't do this, stop doing this, no, we don't want this. They're still continuing pushing their storyline.
Hmm. So they were trying to frame Castro, but they were actually, but the people who actually killed JFK, you think, are actually anti-Castro
Correct.
activists or CIA. Do you think they were CIA or CIA assets? Do you think the CIA was actually involved in the
There were
assassination, or
yeah,
did they
there
use
were there were CIA officers, operations
they? Okay.
officers, uh, yeah, guys that had been on the maritime missions with these people, guys that had gone into Cuba with them. As the CIA as an organization, no, I don't think so. Although I think the CIA was having problems with what JFK wanted to do with Cuba. So certain high level officers may have talked about a need to do something. We know that's the way it always worked. Nobody issued orders for that sort of thing. You sat down in a room and said, you've got to do something about this. And everybody nods their head and walks out,
Yeah.
and something
Right.
happens.
Well, and that's kind of, I mean, they didn't kill Trump, right? But we know from the first administration that there were definitely these like covert attempts to undermine him constantly, right? They were constantly trying to, and that's all now come out. So you're saying it was kind of a similar thing where maybe there wasn't like an actual operation undermine, you know, it wasn't like
It's,
a legitimate operation, but we know it happened. We know that they were doing that. And so you're saying it's kind of the same sort of where they just kind of get together
yeah,
and they're like, somebody's got to stop this guy. And so, how are
I
we going
had
to
to
stop
teach.
him?
I had to teach myself this. I wrote a book called Nexus. That's a study of how the CIA does political assassinations, and you know it, how they do it, and they do it consistently. I mean, it they do it consistently because it works. Sometimes it works. It's not always deniable, but there is a pattern. Yeah, and the same
Hmm.
pattern shows up here. Yeah, you don't those operations are all done with money that's, you know, not lots of money, but with assets, with people that you can trust with. And the, the, the Cuban exiles, as I said, they considered themselves patriots. The, the Cubans always, CIA, if you want to be deniable, it's just like with Oswald. If you want to manipulate Oswald, you tell him things he wants to do. He's not
Hmm.
an asset. He's manipulated. With the Cuban exiles, with any surrogates, the CIA always picked people that were already doing what they wanted to do, which means revolutionaries or smuggling. You pick people that are already doing it. You use them. You don't
Yeah.
pay them necessarily. You use them. That's the
Hmm.
key. Then that gives you deniability.
Yeah, and we see that all the time. I mean, with even in the Middle East, right? All of the funding and training of Al Qaeda or the Mujahideen, and it turns into Al Qaeda, and it's and then people say, you've got guys like Rand Paul that say, "Don't you think this was kind of a bad idea for us to be giving money and training to these guys that ended up becoming ISIS?" Like. You can't, but that's to your point. They're using people who already, they're not bringing in new people and having them pretend. They're taking people that already have a certain ideology and utilizing them for their own gain. And we even see that in the mainstream media. I mean, just on a small scale, when the mainstream media has certain narratives that they're maintaining, they're hiring newscasters who genuinely believe those things, and that's what they're putting on. That's who they're putting in those roles. Is they don't tell them necessarily what to say. They just let them be, and they know that they're going to be sharing the narrative that they want shared. Right. So
You want sincerity. I mean,
yeah,
sincerity
right.
is really important. But it's interesting that you mentioned that. I remember looking at a CIA memo from Pakistan, and it's
Hmm.
a headquarters memo telling them to stop training these Islamic recruits on how to make IEDs, stop training them on sniper rifles, and the guys in the local office. This is an internal office memo. It says like, wait, well, this is really working well because we're killing a lot of Russians. And this is an internal memo. Doesn't go back to headquarters. It says, all right, let's just stop telling headquarters we're doing this. Doesn't mean we have to stop doing it. We just have to stop
Right.
reporting that we're doing it.
Right. Oh, they really have adopted the don't ask, don't tell, or like or the just do it and ask for forgiveness later. I mean, they've really adopted that mentality you're saying inside of these agencies. Is that's how they
It's
operate.
sort of having been in corporate America, it's more like, is this going to help my performance appraisal or not?
Yeah. Right.
It will. Okay, I'm going to do it. Well, cool.
Whatever happened to Oswald's wife and children?
They were obviously traumatized for the event. Oswald's wife kind of got trapped in a really bad situation in that she had known some things, like we're talking about, known some things that Oswald had done that, especially from a Russian legal point of view, were illegal. You know, uh,
Hmm.
and she was very worried. Actually, she was manipulated by the Warren Commission because she didn't know what they might charge her with. And it's interesting. She has a whole series of interviews with the FBI, and at that point in time, she clearly doesn't know that she's not just sent back to Russia. She wanted to go back to Russia, but she might be charged as an accessory and a variety of things. When she finally testifies to the Warren Commission, her representative says, and I think this is a very important quote, Marina now understands that she's not going to be prosecuted, so now she can tell the truth. So one of the issues that we have is there are discontinuities in her testimony. It's
Hmm.
very situational. It's like what she's saying at a given point in time versus what she fears for her children, where she is. It's very, very dramatic situation for her. But she eventually did remarry. Her children are both adults. I mean, everybody stayed in the U.S. Uh,
Hmm.
Interestingly enough, she got a lot of donations. There were a lot of people that were concerned for her because it was pretty clear that she'd been in a difficult. She was not a Russian spy. Let's put it that way.
Right.
You know,
Right.
you and so uh, things worked out in a way for her. Although it was interesting. There's absolutely she was told so many times early on, and she herself will say this that Oswald was guilty. That she accepted that he must have been guilty. You know, she one of the things that she says though is it makes it difficult to deal with from a historical standpoint is to separate what people were telling her
Hmm.
from what she knew herself. And there were often disconnects, but you know, who are you going to believe if they tell you that they have absolutely solid evidence that your husband did it? Are you going to have doubts? Um, well, maybe he did. But later she learned enough and actually was provided enough information to understand that it wasn't what she had been told. So she did change
Hmm.
her view.
Oh, she did. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, Did his kids change their last name?
Um, they married. They didn't
Okay.
change their last name for a while. So, and she did, their names are changed, but all due to marriage, not due
Okay.
to
Oh,
changing their name from Oswald.
interesting.
Um,
Where does Jack Ruby come into this? I know that the book is about
uh,
Oswald and this was a deep dive into Oswald, but what the hell does Jack Ruby have to do with the Cubans?
that's in Tipping Point. Oh, okay.
Okay.
What Jack Ruby has to do with the Cubans is that Jack Ruby was very involved in Cuba from Castro Revolution on. Actually, Jack Ruby, most people don't know this, was an FBI informant for
Hmm.
over a year on gun running to Cuba. And guess
Huh.
what case it involved? It involved the case of this fellow that Oswald ultimately went to visit about buying guns in 1963. The name's McCowan. Um, Ruby was involved in Cuba for a couple of different reasons. He served as a courier to carry money and arrangements to get one of the casino bosses out of Cuba. He
Hmm.
was doing this for Meyer Lansky and John Roselli out of Vegas. They wanted to get him out. He had been imprisoned by Castro. He, Jack wanted to sell stuff, including guns, jeeps, whatever, into Cuba. And so actually, Ruby had a connection to this McCowan person that Oswald, years before Oswald visited McCowan. Uh,
Hmm.
Oswald's connections, Ruby's connections, step back. Ruby's connections were to Cuba and ended up being to Cuba through a fellow named Johnny Roselli. I don't know if you've heard the name John Roselli. John Roselli was part when the CIA decided to assassinate Castro. They felt that they had to use Cuban assets. Again, deniability. So who has some reach into Cuba? It's the casino people, Americans who are running the gambling casinos, and quite frankly, organized crime.
Mm.
Roselli was actually had been in Cuba running Castro casinos for Meyer Lansky for the crime syndicates. Uh, so they recruit Roselli. Roselli joins into this Castro assassination project in 1960 and is still part of this Castro assassination project in 1963. So the clique that I was talking about of CIA officers and
Hmm.
anti-Castro Cubans includes Johnny Roselli, who has ties to Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby was brought into the plot as, think of it as local support. He knows crooked policemen in Dallas. He knows who can be bought. He knows Dallas itself. If you're going to put a team in town to do assassinate, you need some local support. Jack Ruby
Okay.
was that support. Jack Ruby was told that's all that he needed to do. Just kind of make a few introductions, do a few low level things, and on the afternoon of the assassination, after Oswald was taken into custody, Jack Ruby received a telephone call from Las Vegas and immediately broke down because he was told his job had changed. His job now was to kill Lee Harvey Oswald. And he was told that he understood the terms. His sister was at risk. And I know this is a gross part of the story, but it's all documented. After receiving that call, Jack Ruby went to his sisters. His sister said what was wrong. He immediately went into the bathroom and started throwing up, according to his sister. And Jack Ruby was not a JFK fan. This is not what prompted that. It's because he had been given a change in direction that he would pursue until he made it happen.
Mm. Wow. Um, so it was all Cuba. It was all over Cuba. That's what your research has led you. Interesting.
I would say that at the highest levels we were talking about, certainly there were people in the CIA that didn't like JFK's, they didn't like his tendency towards neutrality. JFK
Hmm.
did not want to go to World War III. He didn't want to go to nuclear. He had gone neutral in Laos. It was working. It looked like he might be forcing Vietnam into a neutrality position. They didn't like that. So it's at that level, there was a lot of opposition to JFK's policy, pragmatic policies, neutrality
Yeah,
policy. You got to get out of some of these things. So I won't say
sure.
that there weren't other factors in effect, but for the guys down on the ground, it was about Cuba. In fact, some of them, I've been told, uh, were after it was all over, and I'm talking to a family member of one of these people, said that they realized that to some extent they had been used because somebody had used their agendas, and it wasn't all about just their agenda.
Hmm.
They themselves, they weren't unhappy about what they'd done, but they felt that it wasn't as clear cut, you know, that they had been manipulated too. And I think that's
Yeah, I
very
mean,
likely.
I right, that seems likely considering Castro was never framed for JFK's assassination.
Yeah.
So it didn't go as planned, as what they thought would happen didn't happen. And so yeah, there's questions of were they also used? Everybody was used, and who was ultimately using them? All of,
And that's it,
a
Kim.
lot of different.
That's exactly what they said to me. Your words are exactly. We realize that somebody. Exactly what you just said.
Yeah. Hmm. So interesting. Larry, so interesting. You've written so many books. What you mentioned a book that I thought sounded really interesting. Also, Nexus, you said you wrote about CIA operations, about
Next,
their cycle, about what is that one about?
I stepped through this from the conspiracy. Was there a conspiracy? But then I decided if I was going to understand it, and if the CIA had done it, what did their practices look like? So I wrote a
Yeah.
book about CIA political assassination from Iran, uh, you know, Latin America, all the way through. What does it look like when they do it? How do they make the decision? How do they operationalize it? Where do we see it? Can we
Hmm.
see it in other places? So if it was in Dallas, would we recognize it? So
Has
Nexus is
most of
all
your
about.
about those types of that sounds really interesting to read as how they go about doing it, and probably by reading that one would be able to see it happening in real time, might be able to actually suss it out and say, oh well, they're doing it again, here it is, same playbook, and people are gobbling it up. So interesting. Do most of your book, how many books have you written?
I think it's up to about 14 now.
Wow.
Uh,
Are
they
do
all
they
have.
mostly do they mostly revolve around JFK and the assassination?
No, I've written books on the Martin Luther King assassination and that conspiracy, which was entirely different and had to do with far right racism. Uh,
Uh-huh.
uh, about so on political assassinations, but also a book called Surprise Attack on how the country prepares and deals with exactly that. How do we prepare for attacks? That went all the way from Dallas on through 9/11. So what I try to do is model these things. Like how does the country perform? How do these things work in real life? So we know what we would expect, and
Mhm.
are we ready for that? Are we making the right? I wrote a book called Creating Chaos, which is on political warfare. And how do we recognize that? Could you
Mm.
actually, what you just said is, could you, we have a DEFCON scale, defense condition scale for military
Mhm.
action. Could we do a DEFCON scale for political warfare? Yeah, we
Hmm.
could because we know what it looks like. We don't, but we could.
Yeah. Interesting. Really interesting, Larry. All right. So this latest book is titled The Oswald Puzzle, Reconsidering Lee Harvey Oswald. Very deep dive into his history. I know each chapter is a deep dive into his life, and then you do get into, of course, the whole conspiracy that happened. But I know a lot of people that are very interested in this subject, and I think you've laid out, I think, some really compelling and interesting information that I'd certainly never heard before. And Larry, we really appreciate you. We do have the link down below for the book if people want to pick that up. When did it come out?
It actually is pre-ordered now, but it
Oh, it's
ships on
pre-order, right?
January 15th. Yeah.
That's right. Okay, because what I was reading earlier, it was like a the Cliff's Notes version, I suppose, still quite long. That was like 25 pages that I had to kind of get through
I was I was
earlier.
reminding myself what was in each chapter. It's kind of like, well, maybe they would like to know that too.
Yeah, no, it was great. It was great. Okay, so it's out. It's on pre-order right now. Releases January 14th, it looks like. So we do have that link down below for the pre-order. Thank you so much for being here. This was really a really interesting conversation. I really appreciate it, Larry.
I appreciate it. It's great to have a good conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Is there any other way that people can contact you? I mean, we've got the link to the book down below. Do you want any other information out there?
I do have a WordPress blog. That would be it.
Oh, okay. All
Peacock on
right.
WordPress. Do a blog there.
All right. We will go ahead and add that. So thank you again, Larry. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
All right, guys, that is it for tonight's show. Thank you so much for joining. Really interesting conversation. Again, those links are down below. And I think that's it, guys. We'll see you on Monday, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. If you want to contact me over the weekend, by all means, you can email me, kim@kimiversen.com. All right, I'll see you on Monday, guys. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.